joining this panel discussion today. We're talking about the effects of pipelines on vulnerable communities. I'm Erin Murphy, and I'm a senior attorney with Environmental Defense Fund on our Energy Markets and Utility Regulation team. I'm going to do a quick rundown of our panelists, and then I'm going to provide a little bit of background information based on some sort of research and analyses on this topic before turning it over to a discussion with the panel. And there are no slides at all, so we're just having a conversation here today. So our panelists, if I can go in what I think is alphabetical order, I'll start with Debrae Burns, who I think you heard from the reporter earlier today about the Satartia incident. Debrae is a survivor of that CO2 pipeline break in Satartia, Mississippi. And we're thankful to him and to all the panelists for joining us today. Linda Daugherty is the Deputy Associate Administrator for Pipeline Safety Field Operations at Department of Transportation, PHMSA. And at her request, I will not be reading the full paragraph of her bio, so I'll keep it succinct for everyone. Dr. Maria Reyes is the Deputy Director of Commission Shift, which is a statewide nonprofit in Texas working on reforming the Railroad Commission. And Lisa Sorg is an award-winning environmental investigative reporter with North Carolina Policy Watch, or NC Policy Watch, but from North Carolina. So thanks to everyone for being here with us. We're talking about the effects of pipelines on vulnerable communities, and I wanted to start with just sort of information as a baseline, which is that we know that research, data, and lived experiences demonstrate that pipeline infrastructure in the United States can disproportionately burden vulnerable communities, and that includes lower income and minority communities. And today we're talking about that problem and also looking to identify solutions and pathways for improvement. I want to acknowledge that my professional focus and sort of background is on natural gas pipelines, but we are going to be talking more broadly, and all pipelines, have effects and are located in communities that can have negative impacts for folks. So we're going to cover everyone, but some of this data I'm sharing at the start is a little more gas pipeline focused because that's where my thinking and experience comes from. So I wanted to share a 2021 peer-reviewed analysis from some researchers at North Carolina State found that the existing network of natural gas gathering and transmission lines in the U.S. is concentrated more heavily in counties where people experience higher levels of social vulnerability. And that social vulnerability metric is an integrated measure of a community's capacity to prepare for, deal with, and recover from pollution and other hazards. And it takes into account demographic details such as racial composition and age distribution, as well as other socioeconomic information. And so that analysis looked at the social vulnerability index on a county level, and again found that gathering and transmission lines tend to be more heavily concentrated in counties with higher social vulnerability. And thinking about what are the impacts of pipelines, you have easements that put practical limitations on what you can do and how you can use land. You have the direct safety impacts of increased risk or in fear of leaks, rupture, and explosions. And then there's research indicating that safety and other concerns about pipelines can erode the sense of belonging felt by communities, particularly for rural communities. And that research shared some conclusions and recommendations, including the need to consider cumulative impacts when thinking about infrastructure. So, if you're citing new infrastructure and you think about it sort of in isolation, that can miss the accumulation of other existing energy infrastructure and pipelines in a location. And as that starts to build up, again, that's when you start to see those real sort of overburdening of the communities where the infrastructure is located. Researchers have also identified that there's a research gap regarding the socioeconomic and health impacts associated with midstream energy infrastructure, and emphasize the difficulty in assessing risks due to confidentiality and security concerns around making some of that data public, which of course then makes it hard to do some of the analyses that help us understand these impacts. The other study I wanted to call out is a 2022 peer-reviewed study that looked at gas pipeline leak locations on distribution systems. And I think we have one of the authors of this paper in the audience, Joe Von Fisher at Colorado State. Hi, Joe. This research found that neighborhoods with more people of color and lower household income tended to have more gas leaks. So the average leak density, which is the number of leaks per mile on a pipeline, increased by 37% for those populations compared to predominantly white neighborhoods. And leak density also increased slightly in neighborhoods with older housing infrastructure, which can be another indicator of wealth in some instances. So we know that those gas leaks on distribution lines, much like the gathering and transmission lines, can pose safety threats, can also make people sort of feel nervous in their community if they know that there's leaks on pipelines, and can also harm vegetation, which can be a big issue in urban areas where tree cover is really important for mitigating heat and for also providing aesthetics. So thinking about that sort of chunk of data that I just threw at everyone, I think there's a lot more information out there, right? But we know that as a baseline, pipelines tend to be located in places where they can have more of an impact on vulnerable communities. And then it's not just about where the pipeline is, but also what it does while it's there, right? And what happens. And so there's a lot of sort of implications from having a pipeline in your community beyond just the construction of it. So I want to turn it over to the panel and just start by talking about what is it like for members of a community to live near a pipeline. And in particular, and Lisa, I know this is something that we chatted about a little bit at one point, and Debrae, I want to hear your perspective on this as well. Do people know a pipeline is in their community unless and until there's a major incident or something goes wrong?
Most people don't. Most people don't, especially the people that are not, like 5 miles from it. You've seen people like we ride up the road and you see people working. What y'all got going on? We got we're putting a pipeline through. So, but if people don't ask, they wouldn't know.
In the case of the Colonial Pipeline, which was a gasoline pipeline, they had a spill of 2 million gallons on August 14th, 2020 in Huntersville, which is a suburb of Charlotte. And people did not know that the pipeline was there. The leak occurred in a nature preserve, and it was discovered by 2 teenagers riding ATVs and it was kind of like the Beverly Hillbillies, if you've ever seen that, where they're, Texas tea, but instead of oil, it was gasoline. And so people had no idea until these kids found it.
Erin, do you mind?
No, go right ahead.
So one thing we also found is, the general public often does not know something that's not in their immediate vicinity. You may not even know what those line markers are. But what is also significant is often emergency responders don't know what's going through their community. And we saw that in the case of San Bruno. And there's been a lot of effort to try to make sure people are aware. But the question is, how do you create awareness? When it's not a top priority, it's like, what do we not know? And how do we know to pay attention to what we don't know? And so it's a constant battle, both with the public and with emergency responders, because when something bad happens, who do you want to know what's there and what's going on, right? You want your emergency responders to say, I know what that is, I'm going to address it. So, and also the public. The public has to know if something goes wrong, if the worst happens, what does the community do? Do they know the correct action to take to protect themselves, right?
Yeah. Thanks for that. And maybe let's talk a little about how does a community react and how does their perception change to pipeline infrastructure, in and around their community when there is a safety or another sort of incident that folks become aware of. What does that do for sort of the relationship? Can there be an erosion of trust there?
No, I don't trust them at all. I can't trust them at all. I mean, I've listened to people talking about safety and what they're trying to do to prevent what happened in Satartia, but you really can't. There's no way. I mean, like, we live in the pipeline that runs down through Satartia. We live in hills, and the ground is always shifting, always. And environmental people should know about this. If it rains, something's gonna fall, something's gonna hit, and that's exactly what happened in Satartia. And we were unaware. We had no way of knowing what was going to happen. I was just driving down the road, coming back from a nice day of fishing, didn't know anything until boom, I watched it, I saw it, and I had seconds to call my mother and tell her, Mama, this pipeline blew up. We on our way to come get y'all. And as I turned down the road, as my cousin turned down the road, the car just shut off. We had no time. No time. So no, I can't trust that. I moved out of Satartia since then. So.
And did you know it was a CO2 pipeline?
I didn't know what was, I knew it was a pipeline, but I didn't know what was going through it, And a lot of people try to tell us, well, CO2, it doesn't hurt you. But I tell you what, put a plastic bag over your head for a couple of hours and take it off and tell me how you feel. So, I am very untrustworthy of that.
And I wonder, Maria, if you want to speak to, in Texas, there's a lot of pipeline infrastructure in Texas where your organization is doing work. What is sort of community perception like there?
I feel like I am in NPR, right? I've arrived. So Texas is a very convoluted state. But I was in the presence of a lot of people for the past 2 days and today that have suffered the consequences even outside of Texas. And, that's bringing a whole new perspective to the issue. But in Texas, we do have a big beast. Texas has over 488,000 miles of pipes, and about 200,000 of that is unregulated. And then on top of that, there are types of pipes, small pipes, pipes that have not been recorded, right, that add to the list. And so because of that, we have explosions that are not incidents. So the definition of incidents becomes very significant. And if you've attended, some of the conversations today, I'm glad someone else has also been talking about this idea. How do we define an incident? Little kids have died in Texas. And because it was a pipe that was 100, feet from a household, no one became responsible for that, right? And so it is a consequence of the poor. It is a consequence and a cost that is being carried by people that do not speak Spanish because it tends to concentrate on those areas. And so we do have to start thinking in terms of who are we sacrificing for this development, especially in the state of Texas. And so it is convoluted, and I'm one of the blessed that haven't experienced any of these consequences, but I have to let you know that I take your stories with me, and they inspire me. They inspire me to continue fighting, so.
One thing that's also important, I think, is after the accident, after the spill or the leak or whatever, there's been a real erosion of trust, at least in Huntersville, in that the narrative changed. And of course, things can be a fluid situation, but even after it had settled down, first it was, Colonial had, detected a pressure drop at their Alpharetta facility. Then no, the ATV kids found it, and then they reported it in. So there was already a narrative switch. And even state lawmakers were very concerned about that. And then the town hosted a meeting it was during COVID, so it was online, but they hosted a meeting with Colonial, and it was very self-congratulatory, like, wow, we got this taken care of, we're great. And that fooled no one. One of the quotes at the time from Colonial was, the majority of the product was recovered as it was released. At that point, it was 63,000 gallons. It is now 2 million. It's clearly that the majority of the product was not recovered as it was released. So I think it's very important that afterward that there's got to be some kind of trust built, and that's only comes through honesty. I mean, granted, you don't know exactly how many barrels or gallons, but to say the majority of it had been recovered when you really don't even know what the end result is, that's no way to build trust.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising that because I think it's so important. And I want to, I feel like we're talking some about trust between the community and the operator of a pipeline. But I want to also maybe talk a little bit about the role of regulators there. Because I think even when there's not an incident, but in particular when something happens for a community, they're, hearing Debrae share the total lack of trust that you feel in the operator. I think there's a real importance for the regulator to be for the community to be able to feel like there's sort of someone stepping in and taking charge and holding folks accountable. And I feel like I'm saying all of this, so I need to give Linda a chance to maybe, speak to that. But I also want to hear from everyone about sort of, what do you view as that relationship and like maybe what do you want to see out of a regulator in a community, right, when something happens?
So do you want me to tell my story?
Go right ahead.
So that was a setup. I asked her if I could share a story, something that happened to me over the last year. Actually, when the Biden administration came in, they sent, the secretary sent down a message and said, we want everybody to think about how we can address equity issues. How can we do better? How can we do better on climate change? Can we do better on energy transformation? And one of the issues that came was equity. And my response was, well, pipelines are equitable, right? Right? Everybody that needs natural gas gets them, right? And so I was kind of dismissive of our role in this area. And we had two, and I'll admit they were younger, more innovative thinkers that said, hey, we want to tackle this. We want to look at this issue. And they went off and did their study, and they came back, and they presented information that floored me. And have you ever been in a situation where your bias hit you in the face hard? So they presented information that showed very similar, and it must have been occurring at the same time as the study you mentioned, that showed that a 5-year-old growing up in a socially disadvantaged area was more likely to experience a pipeline incident than a 5-year-old growing up in an affluent area. Okay, I started as a pipeline safety inspector, right? 30 years ago, I was out inspecting pipelines. And I looked at the data and I said, that can't be right. Well, I was wrong. I was very wrong. So, proceed forward. I started having discussions with people. Why would that be? Because you have a defensive mechanism, right? My job has been a safety regulator for all people for 30 years. Why is there this discrepancy? So, it's older infrastructure, right? Older cities, right? You have disadvantaged areas where they tend to be in urban areas, in the older parts of town. What have you got in the older parts of town? You got older infrastructure, right? Oh, that's what's going on, right? Next part. I'm thinking back, and this is self-disclosure. I'm thinking back when I was a young inspector, and I was out doing a pipeline inspection. And it was Thursday afternoon. I don't remember the exact details, but it was at the end of my inspection, and part of what we do is we select random locations. I told you I was going to get emotional. I'm already shaking. We select random locations to go out and do field visits, right? We've already checked procedures. We've checked records. We're going to pick random locations. It's Thursday night or Friday morning, and I'm looking at the locations, and I say, I want to go here, here, and here. And the company says, okay, well, we're going to have to get a police escort for this area. And I'm like, oh, man, I've got a flight. I'll get it next time. I didn't go back. How many regulators, safety inspectors, don't go back because it's too hard or it's too scary? Those vulnerable communities, again, think of the 5-year-old. Okay, so then it's almost like the universe ordained this. I go to a meeting and I'm talking to a number of industry representatives. And I'm telling them this story. I say, I can't believe this data. I can't believe what this says. And they're like, yeah, we know. It's true. What do you mean it's true? And I'm thinking, I can't believe you as industry are telling me this, a regulator. And I had one lady raise her hand and she said, yeah, my maintenance crews are always saying, why do we always go spend more time and more money in these affluent areas and not in the disadvantaged areas? Next week, the very next week, I'm speaking to a group of state pipeline safety inspectors like me, but at the state level. I'm telling this story. Can you believe this? And around the room, the state inspector said, yeah, we know. Getting those police escorts are very difficult. So you want to tell me, it makes me mad, it makes me furious. So when you have this knowledge, you must act on it. Ethical, morally, you must do something. I will say, to the credit of every group I have spoken to about this, they have acted. I'm going to tell you what, am I spending too much time? Can I tell you?
Good.
I will tell you, when I spoke to industry, after I spoke to them, they called the next week and said, we need to see that data, we want to talk. And they're taking action. I've talked to industry, I said, you need to compare your data. Now let me tell you where this data comes from, because you are going to have access to it. We're making it publicly available. We are taking the data. It basically took the Center of Disease Control Socially Vulnerable Areas. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. I call it SVI. And it compares those socially vulnerable areas based on census tracts and pipeline incidents. Where do pipeline incidents occur relative to these census areas? We've created an interactive map. So you can go look. You will be rolling that out hopefully before the end of the year. Blaine Keener, who you may have heard, he's actually speaking in the other room. It's his team that's developing this. And you're going to be able to go out and look at a pipeline and look at the incidents on those pipelines and look at the communities that they're in. We've told companies, you need to check where your pipelines are and your incident history and your safety condition history in these areas. Okay, that's what industry's doing. I spoke with the NTSB. You heard Jennifer Hamady. Both PHMSA and NTSB are going to take these issues into consideration when we make determinations of launching. Chris Rule right there is running the program for looking at this when he launches, when he determines to launch for PHMSA. Okay? Next, I want you to know, and I'm about done, not only are we rolling out this database, there's a gentleman back there, Bill Rush. Bill, put your hand up. Bill Rush is in charge of our community liaisons. We may have some in here. They're developing a program to do specific outreach in socially vulnerable areas because of just what we're talking about here. How many people don't know? We've also modified our inspections because I do not want another inspector saying, I don't want to spend time and wait to go into this area because it's a scary place to go. Our inspectors are going to be asked to schedule inspections deliberately in socially vulnerable areas. We're going to do it deliberately and with intention because of what happened in Satartia, what happens in other places around the country. People don't know, and they have a right to know, and we're going to do our darndest to make sure that those safety protections, that a 5-year-old in a disadvantaged area has the exact same, or even better, safety protections as a 5-year-old growing up in an affluent area.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that we'll get to questions in a little bit. To me, such an essential part of this is that transparency leads to accountability. You can't have accountability without transparency. You can't know if there's inequity without having information and looking at it and considering these issues. And so it's really great to hear about some of those steps. And I want to sort of draw this forward and talk about what does that mean for communities and what can communities themselves do and what do they experience? And Maria, I don't know, maybe if you want to talk a little bit about the, engagement that your organization had on the recommended practice, because I think that, and I know that was discussed earlier, but sort of how the community itself can be part of some of these decision-making processes.
I was a professor in higher education teaching government, and I was driven by empowering the masses by practicing democracy. And I joined Commission Shift in April, and one of the first assignments I got was to make comments on the recommended practices, right? And it was such a great experience. I can't emphasize that enough. The way that they organized it, the way that I got results back telling me which changes were considered and which ones were not. Of course, there were a lot of commas accepted, right? But there were issues that were not addressed. And now we're gonna have a new period of comments. However, and this is where the but comes in, as enthusiastic as I am with the changing paradigm that people are promoting with this new approach, civic engagement is not a new idea. And it isn't in the sense of democracy or in the sense of the power of the people. Engagement has been present for a long time. And when it comes to Texas, a state that is captive by the agency, and where a lot of pipes, because they are intrastate, don't actually fall under the regulation of PHMSA, and where the regulation says follow standards of the API or standards can set by the director of the Railroad Commission, we have a problem. And we have a big problem because if it's happening in Texas, I'm pretty sure it's happening in other states. So I applaud the spirit because it was inspiring to come into a community of safety. Your language of safety was even very much prominent in the Railroad Commission Regulatory Conference. PHMSA and the Pipeline Safety Trust, your culture is different. So I'm gonna tell you, I applaud you and I hope you continue, but we need to do a lot more in the state of Texas, and I'm pretty sure in other states with these standards of engagement. Consider this, and I know that I don't want you to think in terms of I'm biting the hand that's feeding me, but we need more people of color in these panels, okay? So please, every time you have a podcast, consider inviting someone of color. And now you have tribes that you can, reach out. You have people in Louisiana who are suffering big consequences. Invite them, because a lot of these panels still look very much the same. Thank you.
Debrae, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your experience after the incident happened, and in particular, sort of experiences you had with the company and with the regulator, good or bad?
Changed my, excuse me. It changed my life. I mean, I haven't worked since it happened. I was an inspector at a lumber mill and making pretty decent money, supporting my family, like every decent man does, And it's been hard for me because when I had to stop working, I couldn't take care of my daughters like I wanted to. They had to move away to go up there with their mom. They were with me, but they had to go stay with their mom because I was incapable of supporting them. And I'm incapable of supporting myself. I'm suffering from short-term memory loss. Let's say I can be boiling some hot dogs on the stove and forget just like that. I've almost burnt the house down on a couple of occasions. I left something on the stove and my girlfriend, luckily she got up and it was just full of smoke, and accidentally she got burned. And I don't even use the stove anymore. I have to use the microwave or something that beeps to let me know that, okay, you had something on the stove. And back to my job, you know, we have to work at a fast pace. I used to jog 3 to 5 miles every day after I get off work. Now I can't even make it a half of a quarter of a mile without having to use this. I do have asthma, but I had it regulated. I would get sick like when the months change, you know, seasons change, whatever, you know, asthmatics do. But now I have to use this every day. This is my crutch. I have to have it. You know, there's no way around it. If I don't have this, I lose my breath, I lose consciousness. It's hard waking up in the middle of the night and you can't breathe. It's just uncanny. It messed with me physically, emotionally, personally, financially. And you know, when I lost my job, I lost my insurance. So, you know, you can't go to the doctor, you know what I'm saying? Checking on my back, my lungs and all that, it hurts. And you know, that's the only support that I have. And you know, I like taking care of her, but now she's taking care of me, and that's been happening since 2020, so. You talking about, you get emotional. Oh my goodness. But you know, it's been a lot for me, my brother, and my cousin. You know, my cousin was a truck driver. And by us not being able to concentrate like that, he can't get on the road anymore. So, you know, it's just a lot to deal with. And so I tell anybody, you know, I hope you guys do get everything together and get it safe to where if you're gonna run them. But if you're not gonna do it, just don't do it. I mean, that's just the way I feel about it. Because I don't want anybody to have to go through what I'm going through right now. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
Thanks for sharing that. Lisa, I'm thinking about the Colonial spill that you were talking about, and the fact that more information has sort of come out and that the spill had continued to expand. And I just wonder if you could talk more about, you know, what the information sharing dynamic was like, and how the community reacted to that.
Sure. The state regulators and Colonial had a public-facing website that did list some information, although, as I said, there were some trust issues. The groundwater plume is moving gradually. There have been no drinking water wells affected with gasoline at this point. However, Colonial did buy out 3 properties. The remediation is happening in people's backyard. Several people told me, well, my neighbor was bought out, and my neighbor was put on public water, but I'm right on the line. Am I next? People looking out, literally, I stood with a man who looked out his backyard, and there is an air monitor right there. And so he does not feel very confident in his safety and his health. And also, I would say for those regulators, when you put data out there and you're measuring benzene in the air or whatever, people put it in. You don't have to dumb it down, but put it in language people can understand. They don't understand milligrams per liter or microgram. You know, that kind of scientific data means nothing to average folks. If you're not in the world of air pollution or water pollution, you don't know what any of that means. You don't know what the standard is. So it's very important to help people make sense of the information that you're giving them, because a lot of folks in this community were like, well, what does this mean at this level? Is it safe or not? And I would also say that as an aside, one of the ongoing questions that has led to trust is that when you put out a fire, or if there's a risk of ignition, the firefighting foam that is used to put these flames out or to keep it from igniting often contain harmful chemicals. They're called PFAS, they're called perfluorinated compounds. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but they're bad, really bad, even in like small parts per trillion. And so that there's been a lot of discussion between Colonial and the state regulators, because they found PFAS in mixed product, which is water and the F500 foam, and that foam was not supposed to have PFAS in it, and somehow it appeared. So again, people are concerned about that run off into their drinking water wells or the surface water. So, long way of saying this is going to be this was the 32nd spill in North Carolina by Colonial. So and there's still houses that have been bought out and you know, cleanups decades old. This will be going on for at least another, I would say, 10 years. And so people are going to have to live with that and the decline of their property values as well.
Erin, can I add just one note? So thank you. Very, very good information. One thing that I think a lot of people don't know is when a bad thing happens, there isn't a federal agency right now that has responsibility for going out and monitoring health impacts. This is something that Bill Karam, I don't know if he's in here. No, Carl Weimer.
virtual.
Carl Weimer, sorry, Bill. Carl Weimer had brought up. He said, PHMSA, why aren't you out there monitoring health effects? It's totally outside of our area of expertise. We don't have that expertise. And then we started looking at it. So back when the Marshall, Michigan spill happened years ago, the question was who was out there monitoring the BTX in the air and the impact on the people? And the question was who does that? And it turned out to be it was local officials. And the question was you had all these federal agencies, swarms of federal agencies. But none of us have authority or in many cases expertise to do that type of monitoring. So there maybe is a gap there, especially when you're talking about vulnerable communities. Maybe, and I don't know, I want to speak for Satartia, because I love Mississippi, but I think Satartia is kind of a small community, right?
It is.
Yeah, so would the local officials have had the equipment to measure? I don't know.
They didn't.
They didn't? So something to think about when we think about vulnerable communities, whether it be in urban areas, you might have, big fire departments or whatever. What about the small communities? What about the rural areas? So.
And to add in on what she's talking about, in Satartia, like the correspondence, where we were, it's just a little old dirt road right there. Everybody, they checked the town of Satartia. Like Dan said, most people self-evacuated. There was a few still there that they had to get out. And the correspondents were there. And if it wasn't for Jerry Briggs and Terry Gans, they had to come from Vicksburg to Satartia. After they evacuated Satartia, they was like, is there anywhere else that we need to go? Because we need to get out of here. And one correspondent said, look, we checked everything, let's go. And Terry Gans said, there's a little road right behind the post office. If y'all could ride down there, because they were about to leave. And Jerry Briggs said, well, we came to do a job. Let's go down here and check them out. And they found me and my brother and my cousin unconscious in the car, foaming out the mouth. And the correspondent said, first time when he looked at us, he said immediately he thought they're dead. They had to bust the windows out of the car, put the car in park, bust the windows out the car to get us out. They were gonna try to take us out one by one. And Jerry Briggs said, no, we're gonna have to load all of them up on this ATV. And you think about 3 grown men on an ATV, and then they threw their tanks, everything on top of us. The way he described it, we had to load them up like dead deer. And the ATV was sputtering, and it took him about 15 minutes to get us out of there. But he told me himself, I got a chance to thank them, hug them, talk to them. And he said, if we got there about 5 minutes later, you probably wouldn't be sitting here beside me. And they're talking about building trust. It blew up on us, and then a few months later, it ruptured again. But at this point, nobody was injured. So, it's hard to build trust when stuff like this happens. The impact is great. And like a little old town like Satartia, we don't have a lot of, people don't come talk to us. We don't pretty much, get out and be, expressing ourselves. And I just want to say thank y'all for giving me the opportunity to tell y'all what happened to us. That's all.
Thanks for sharing that. We have 15 minutes, and I want to make sure we take questions, but I also want to make sure we talk at least a little bit about solutions and positive steps that we can take forward. So I kind of just want to open it up before we go to questions and ask, Linda, I know you shared a lot of positive steps that PHMSA is working on and moving forward on. Does anyone else want to, share what you think should be done, or something that is being done to improve vulnerable communities' experiences with pipelines?
I would like to invite people to take with you the spirit of meaningful engagement. Environmental justice standards are about dignity to the human, how a human has to have the recognition of deciding for themselves what can harm them and what cannot harm them. We need to be involved in your decision making when it comes to development. Take that spirit with you. Talk to people that have been affected so you can take their stories, so that the industry can start taking into account these standards, because they are about the spirit of deciding for ourselves how to rule ourselves, how to live in nature or in accordance or in balance with our own spaces, how we have to think of survival, and how we need to move away from a total economic mind. And this is a paradigm shift. That's the paradigm shift you need to start thinking about. This is what regenerative economics is calling for. This is where we are uniting with our past in the tribal spirit. Can we see nature, water, air, our land as part of our decision-making process? Because our water is disappearing. We use it for the extraction of gas, of oil. Our air is contaminated. Our health is being affected. And we continue to talk about what? In many areas of the United States, we don't have the question of can we collaborate? It is a decision of can we even survive with more of this pipe development? And I need you to take that with you, because that is the question we're asking ourselves of surviving. I know that didn't sound positive, but I swear if you take it with you, it's going to feel you, okay?
That's awesome.
Connectivity feels us, so I'm sorry.
No, it was awesome. Thanks for that. I think we could go ahead and take some questions. I know this gentleman had his hand raised earlier. Did you still have a question, sir?
I do, yes. Use
got
the
it.
mic, please. Thank you. I worked for a utility company for 30 years before I retired. I'm a consultant now. I'll share with you one where we did it the right way. And here's what I'm going to add to anybody in the room that's in a leadership decision. Make the tough decisions. Do the job. You don't have to if you don't want to, but you're going to darn well wish you had. We had a situation. I asked for the music also. But can't make this up. Okay. Well, here's what happened. When we look at, it says vulnerable communities, they don't have to necessarily be poor. The situation I'll share with you now was happened up in the Northeast in a middle class, predominantly black, but a lot of brown people, nice houses, good jobs. 3 generations they had to fight a gas leak of about maybe 300 pounds per square inch. That's about maybe 2 of you standing on a pogo stick. That's the pressure in the pipe. Now, at a certain point, there were patches all over the street. There were trees burned, cars burned out, siding burned off of houses. Then I remembered in 3 different assignments I'd been out there. Now I'm in charge of maintenance on the transmission pipe. And what we were doing was just imagine the window panes up there and all these supports being just the piping. No one would look at the entire wall there and say, let's look at everything together. We look at this piece, that's not that bad. We look at the middle piece, that's not that bad. They were all calling that a grade 3 leak. That's the lowest grade leak you have. But when you put all that together, it was a tremendous hazard that was left there. So we don't have the money in the budget. I said, do we have the money to go to court? What do you think we should do? I said, we're going to spend the money. So I had the whole thing just done. But the point I'm making here is that you can't play the budget game. You've got to look at the big picture. You've got to spend this. You've got to have leaders every place making the right decision. They don't necessarily have to be black or brown or whatever. But one of the ladies was a retired teacher, and I'll leave you with this. She tugged on me when I came out. She pointed to me all the damage. And she says, Mr. Miles, we can put a man on the moon. Why can't we fix this problem? And that's the challenge I'll make to you professionals in the room. Why can't you fix it? Thank you.
Very good points.
Thank you, Mr. Burns, for sharing your story. I appreciate that. So I'm a grad student, but I'm also work for a pipeline company. And one of the things I learned this semester is obviously PHMSA, through the 1990 Oil Pollution Act, has the ability to institute settlement funds. And in the case of like BP's Deepwater Horizon, there was $20 million set aside in Louisiana for those impacted by that event. So I was just curious about Satartia, how the company is maybe taking care of you or the other community members and your health needs specifically. And if PHMSA, I don't know a lot about this event, sorry I haven't researched it, but if there was a settlement dollar set aside for things like this.
They had a meeting after which in the town hall in Satartia, and I call it. They paid pretty much everybody in Satartia. I call it hush hush money. I really do, but I didn't sign any papers. I have somebody talking for me, but as far as them reaching out to me, I haven't heard anything from them. I mean, nothing. Like I said, that's the person that's taking care of me so far. So I haven't heard anything from them. Like I said, I do have representation, but as far as them reaching out to me, I haven't heard anything since 2020. So it's still ongoing. So I don't know how long this is going to play out, but I'm here to fight. You know, I'm not going to just take it laying down. So that's pretty much all I can say about that.
I would also say that in Huntersville, the state regulators did fine a civil penalty on Colonial of $4.7 million. In the state of North Carolina, that goes to the local school system. It does not go to the impacted residents. I'm not saying that schools shouldn't get, money from civil penalties, but that would have to be taken care of through private litigation. This is a middle-class community, but, they're not made of money. That's very expensive to go up against Colonial with your own litigation. PHMSA did not fine them. There was a consent order. So $4.7 million plus another $1.7 to buy out the homes, you're looking at $6 million, plus, of course, the cleanup. But frankly, $6 million to Colonial is like if you lost $3 in the dryer. I mean, it's not that much money. And the impacted residents aren't seeing any of it.
And if you want just another way for you to make a difference, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to vote. I mean, if you're thinking in terms of why PHMSA cannot do anything, or the EPA, or they don't have teeth. Why don't they have teeth? Because legislators have taken it away. Why have they taken it away? Because economic interests matter and states' rights have risen. So if you want federal authority to have teeth, you're going to have to vote the right way. And if you don't want that, then you're going to have to go back to your states and start paying attention to those elections to select the legislators that actually care about the issues you want to. Go vote.
This is Joe Von Fisher at Colorado State University. I wanted to echo Linda's finding. We published that work finding that natural gas leaks in local distribution companies were more likely, in fact, the greatest predictor of leak frequency was % people of color. It was a better predictor than income, and even if we accounted for housing age, which might have been a correlate for the age of infrastructure, it was still the percent people of color. These are the vulnerable communities you're talking about, and I wanted to echo that when we went in the field, there were places that we couldn't go, we were told we couldn't go because of safety risk. And when I've raised this with the utilities individually we've talked to, they abhor the statement and push back and say, no, this can't be, but I completely agree with you. I mean, out of total ignorance, I have no idea how to handle that. I mean, it seems like we just have to say, you have to go there. That's part of the job. That's the deal, period. Is that it? Is that where it ends?
That absolutely is true. And so there's different levels that's to provide safety oversight, right? The primary responsibility is with that utility or pipeline operator. It is their responsibility to make sure every part of their system is maintained and it is safe, period. And it is regulators' jobs to make sure they do it, right? So if the regulator's not going in and checking it, and the company isn't doing it, who's holding them accountable? That's what was so upsetting. We had a total mismatch. People all knew there was an issue, and nobody had figured out how to solve it. Now, I will say this. I don't think many people get up in the morning saying, I'm not going to do my job, or, oh, I don't want to go in this area and take care of this safety risk. I don't think people think that way. Things happen. But when you become aware of the situation, you have to start looking for these things. This is part of my guilt, is that I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking for it. And when the information was presented to me, my initial response was denial. That's that bias that I talked about. So I'm dealing with that, and we're taking action. So what do? We make sure we correct the things that we can correct. We aggressively go. I'm going to give you an example. You talk about how do we reach people in vulnerable areas. Not everybody speaks English. How many communication efforts, we require pipeline operators to have a public engagement, and they'll know, okay, English and Spanish. Not everybody speaks English and Spanish. Another thing, excavator damage. You guys have heard about that, excavation damage, leading cause pipelines. Where are the excavation damage billboards? They're on highways. How many of our most vulnerable communities get out on those highways and see those billboards? The question is, we need to start rethinking about how do we reach the communities? How do we communicate? Not everybody receives information the same way. Not everybody gets on the internet every night. Not everybody gets their news from where everybody gets the news. I don't know. That everybody has a different style. Maybe your vulnerable communities communicate in different ways. You know? May I share one last thing? So we just had an all-inspector meeting. We had all of our inspectors, and we were talking about some of these issues, and we were talking about inspectors, you're going to be asked to go out. You need to make a concerted effort to go in these areas. And if you need to plan for police escort, you need to do it. You're going to plan it out, and you're going to go in these areas. And everybody's like, okay. And then a new inspector came up to me after the meeting, and she said, I don't know if you got that right. I'm thinking, whoa, what do you mean? And she was a woman of color. And she said, police may not be welcome in some areas. You need to work with community leaders. You need to find out from the community how to access these areas. Don't just go, I'm not being disparative towards police. Don't take it that way. What I'm saying you have to meet the community where it is. We have a responsibility, all of us. Whether you're a pipeline operator in this room, you have a responsibility. If you're a regulator in this room, you have a safety responsibility. If you're a member of the public, if you're an activist, if you're a survivor, you have a role holding everybody accountable. And you're doing it by being here. How many people are not in this room? Anyway, sorry. I'm very passionate about this because it was a real hit to me. So Thank you for letting me have the time.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think we have time for one more quick question.
It is working. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that there's been a range of different ways in which we've talked about vulnerability in historically marginalized communities. And some topics we really haven't touched on at all, which is disproportionate siting of projects, right, as a result of distributional justice issues, procedural justice issues we've touched on a little bit in terms of whether or not people have access to decision-making spaces. A lot of what we've been talking about seems to refer to distribution systems where we're talking about the urban core, but there's also a significant amount of vulnerable communities in rural spaces that I'm just trying to list out some of the things that we also need to attend to. But I have a specific question, and that is, as the gentleman noted, sometimes maintenance is a big part of this. And I'm wondering whether or not, Linda, this is directed to you, we're also finding in the data, PHMSA's data, whether or not maintenance is being, disproportionately applied to more well-off communities and being pushed off in poorer communities. And yes, it's an inspection issue, but it's also an investment issue in making sure that we actually maintain existing infrastructure at equal levels.
So very good question, and that is exactly one of the questions that we are engaging on our inspections. We've asked both our state and our federal inspectors. That's one of many questions, is how are you determining where you're doing maintenance? Is there a shift? Now, I'm going to be honest. I speculate. I have no information on this, but I wonder how many companies are incentivized to invest capital, replacement projects, in areas where they may not see future expansion, where it's repairing. Let me give you an example, and I'm thinking of your specific example, which I think was right on. I may use an analogy. I have a car that gets me from point A to point B, and over the years, it gets dents in it, and it starts rusting out. And I think, well, I'm not going to need this car probably, a whole lot longer. Am I going to pay to repair it? Am I going to nickel and dime it? Change out a tire when I need a tire, or am I going to change out all the tires? What am I going to do? And I wonder about the mentality, the thought process of companies that are saying, you know what, people are moving out of that area. Do we want to invest $40 million in replacing that system? Even a rural community. And I may be crossing into dangerous ground here. So I think about, there's a lot of resistance to new pipelines. Sometimes it's a lot better to replace a system than to continue to put Band-Aids on it. And when there's a lot of pushback and say, we don't want you putting a new pipeline in, which I understand, there's reasons, the shift from fossil fuels, you're almost incentivizing the Band-Aid approach. And I'm sorry, when I see Band-Aid after Band-Aid after Band-Aid, just what you were talking about, I'm concerned.
I would like just to point out, my chief executive for Commissionership is right here. And she was an author to an article that she co-partnered with, and the findings were that yes, that maintenance is low in areas of color, in areas of people who speak Spanish, and she can talk to you more about it, but just wanted to let you know, there are some studies out there.
And I should say that's a great reminder that is the study I was talking about. So I should have given equal credit to Virginia and Joe in the audience who both worked really hard on that paper. I think we're... Thank you so much to our panelists, and thanks everyone for joining us and for the good questions. Appreciate it.